Welcome to the second episode of Mystical Connections, Let Your Life Speak, where we have found 33 principles that all of the 11 major religions of the world teach, and these 11 religions represent 82% of the world's population. My name is Tom Wolfe. I'm a Quaker minister. And what we're going to do is use the method that was perfected by William Penn, where he found where religions in their scripture taught the same thing. And where he just did the Greeks and the Jewish scripture, we're going to do all 11 major religions in the world. Our guest today is Jim Zartman. Welcome, Jim.
Thanks. I'm new to these 7 principles, but you said you've been walking with these for quite a while. So these obviously have very deep meaning for you.
Mm-hmm. So what Jim is referring to is that of the 33 principles, the first 7 are about understanding. So if you're ready to jump in.
Let's do it.
Yeah, experience the unity. Because each of the 11 religions that represent 82% of the world has scripture that validates these principles. So if you're ready to go, the first one is the only real existence is that of the one and only God, who is the self in every finite self.
What immediately comes to mind for you? Because you said these have been very close to your heart for like 20 years?
The first 7, yes.
The first 7. So
Yeah.
These all have been really close to you.
Oh, yeah.
Like, so what does this one immediately bring up in you as you hear it?
The transcendent. What happens in my life, Jim, this first principle guides my life probably more than anything besides prayer. And what it does is if I get stuck in my worldly life, if something's not working, let's just use a business example that employee's troubled and it's time to do something about it, but I can't figure out what to do.
Yeah.
If I can go into meditation and prayer and only experience that place formless beyond all worldly activity, beyond all kingdoms, beyond all mind, above all kingdoms. And there's a place that's just existence. It's that I am experience. And from there, I can make a decision from love, which can be tough love. It doesn't necessarily mean you let the person keep their job or whatever it is. But the only real existence is that of the one and only God, and then knowing that same love and truth is, in every finite self. It's in me and it's in whatever person I'm dealing with. It's just guides when I get in the place where do what I call duality, where it's, back and forth and it's not working. I just, before I engage with that conversation, that difficult conversation, I try and experience, not just think about it, but get past thought. And one of the things I love the most is Christ's description of that state as a peace that passes understanding. I don't understand that state, but it's always there for me. God has always God doesn't go anywhere, I go somewhere. But when I go back to that place where we're just one, the only existence is just, and there's just one person there, which is God. It's just from that place and my life straightens out. So that principle has been probably my guiding principle of all principles, is that there's one God. And I'm that same one. The Quakers used to say, what's the difference between Christ and us? The only difference between Christ and us is that he had no sin. And the implication in the Quaker argument for perfection, as opposed to the argument for sin, was always that if we would just stop screwing up, we are that light. There's no difference. We are the light of Christ. There is no difference. We just don't know it, and he did. So the second one is the only real love is the love for this infinity, God, which arouses an intense longing to see, know and become one with its truth. And Jesus says, and it's Mark 12:30 to 31, thou shalt love the Lord thy God with all thy heart and with all thy soul and with all thy mind and with all thy strength. This is the first commandment. And the second commandment is like unto this, thou shalt love thy neighbor as thyself. There is no other commandment greater than these. And then actually there's another one here, John 14:21. Christ says, he who keeps my commandments, he is the one that loves me. And he that loves me shall be loved of my Father, and I will love him, and I will manifest myself to him. So again, I think Christ is definitely saying love is the highest principle.
Yeah, I think this is probably the least debatable point of the of the 33 is this constant and consistent way concept of love, but it gets articulated and understood in so many different ways. Like the meaning of love. I mean, because people honestly have done perverse things with the name of love, calling it love, in violent ways and conquering ways, and so I think it's really important to get love right. I think starting with the idea that if the other person doesn't experience your action as love, it probably isn't.
Yes. Pretty good measure there.
That's a good measure that I think gets forgotten a lot. But since this has held value for you so long, what comes to mind when you hear this?
Well, what in the context of this ministry, Jim, what comes to mind and to my heart is, as you said, I think it's true that love is sort of the least debatable, but every one of the 11 religions says the primary nature of God is two things. One is oneness, and the other is love. So it's kind of amazing to me that is so clear, and yet religion has become, as you know, through history, is not necessarily a force for love, but can be a force for division, economic injustice, racial injustice, and all the way up to warfare. And it's just sort of, if I had to encapsulate this ministry in one concept, is to enable us to love our neighbors in recognizing in their tradition that they're teaching love too. And in this case, principle one, the oneness of God. As William Penn, my favorite quote from William Penn is, there is not a nation in this world, nor an age throughout all time that has been destitute of the discovery of inner light.
Wow.
Yeah.
Say it again. That's rich. Got to do that
Yeah,
again.
that's my.
Yeah,
I'm
slow
into
that
William
one down
Penn.
for the new, hearing that for the first time.
William Penn's mantra, if you will, was, there is not a nation in this world, nor an age throughout all time that has been destitute of the discovery of inner light.
Reminds me of Romans, where Paul says that God has placed eternity in the hearts of all men, that they would know him. It's funny, you read that first quote from Jesus, the love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength, and he says, and the second commandment is like it, and love your neighbor as yourself. That those are actually inseparable actions. I think when it comes to so much of the debate around religion, where people accuse religion of being unloving or of destructive to human nature, I think it's usually in the uncoupling of those two concepts. Oh, they say, well, the Lord wills it, or I love the Lord, and therefore, out of my love for the Lord, I'm going to destroy this.
Right. That's not what Jesus said.
No, he's saying that the second is like it.
Yeah.
It's like it. He puts them in similar. He makes them inseparable. So to negate the second is to negate the first.
Right.
And I think that's a core component to me of what it actually means to be love.
Well, and Christ is not only saying it's a core component, he's saying there is no other commandment greater than that. So I find it interesting that Mayor Baba, in his framing of all this, picked God is one and then love is two.
Mm,
That he's really, I think he's just, and of course, every religion of the 11 has those two. But in fact, those are one and two, I think, for the same reason that Christ is saying, look, the first great commandment is love God. The second one is to love people as yourself.
right. And because
And there's no commandment. The rest of it is relative to those two.
yeah, and another place where Jesus quotes this, he says, all of the law and the prophets are summed up in these two things.
Yes.
So there is this there's this heart behind it that says you don't get to separate things. And I think that's even why these are 1 and 2. A lot of times where things go wrong, where things get off, is because there's a separation of things that are supposed to stay joined. And the oneness and the love thing, if you get the oneness thing, you actually might get the love thing.
Right.
Because if you get oneness, there is no other.
Right.
There is not an other. There's a great line from a musician I like called Gunger, and he does this song called "Us for Them," and the bridge says, "We will not fight their wars. We will not stand in line, because if it's us or them, it's us for them." Oh, and the second part of that, he says, "We reject the either or.
Right.
That can't control us anymore. Because if it's us or them, it's us
for
for
them."
The most compelling thing about Jesus is that he did not just describe love, but he defined it in his actions. Like that the very act of going to the cross with the belief that it's better to be killed by your enemies than to kill your enemies. To pray for your enemies with your dying breath. That is the personification of love.
Sure.
That doesn't just describe it. That actually is the definition of it. And so I think I come back again and again to this powerful image that to me, as an act of love, and I always say that an act of love is an act of God, but this act of love as the sort of the defining moment of love in human history.
All right, are we ready to?
Let's do it. What's the next one here?
I don't want to say leave love.
Yeah, we're not going to leave
We're
love.
not going to leave love, but we're
going to take oneness and love into point
sacrifice.
3.
Okay.
Into sacrifice, yeah.
All right, principle number 3. The only real sacrifice is that in which, in pursuance of this love, referring to the love of God and the love of people, all things, body, mind, position, welfare, and even life itself are sacrificed. And Jesus said himself in John 15:12-13, I've always loved this. This is my commandment, that you love one another as I have loved you. Greater love hath no man than this, that a man lay down his life for his friends. And then from Hebrews 13:16 is, but to do good and to communicate, forget not, for with such sacrifices God is well pleased. So Christ, I agree with you, Jim. Christ's sacrifice on the cross is the ultimate sacrifice. But, we as humans, I think, are called to emulate that and sacrifice for our friends, in the case of this quote from John. And again, with such sacrifices, God is well pleased. It's just...
And I think, but this is a really good question, what this brings up for me, because, we're in the first world. I've had shelter. I'm living in a very comfortable existence in the history of human race. What do you think it looks like, or it means to have a mindset that is sacrificial by nature, living in this kind of an existence?
You don't have to renounce, yeah.
Yeah, I think that gets the confusion is, and I caught myself doing it immediately. I think of sacrifice, and my mind goes to economics.
Well, that's how we look at it, yeah.
Yeah, it tends to be, but we're not necessarily as strapped as a culture for those kinds of resources.
Right.
But how often do you try and get together with someone and they're like, I can pencil you in 3 weeks from now?
Sure.
We are paupers of time, and we are wealthy in acquaintance and poor in friendship.
Yes.
As far as deep relationship.
Sure. Yeah.
And so I wonder if there's like a sacrificial elements if we haven't expanded the imagination to what that actually needs to look like for us.
Well, the Africans say to me when I go over there, they say, you guys, you have watches. But we have time.
Yeah, it's funny. We were working with several refugee families from the Middle East the last couple of years at our church, and it was far easier to pull in several $100s to get them set up in this house and to get the moving truck and get some furniture in the house. And she like getting people to pull together to set them up for a life was relatively simple.
Sure.
For those same people to have time to be friends with them, to go over, to have dinner, to play with the kids was very, very difficult.
Mm-hmm.
And I think, especially in this culture, we actually need to think radically different about our sacrifice in a culture who invented the phrase time is money. And we always think that we're giving away our time here or here or here, that we're actually like losing out or missing out on something else.
Okay, we ready to move on to the next one?
Let's do it.
Okay. The only real renunciation is that which abandons, even in the midst of worldly duties, all selfish thoughts and desires. There you go.
It's funny. I don't think I had heard the term renunciation until I started coming into having some familiarity with other traditions outside of my own. Since I come from the Christian tradition, that was as I said before, my native tongue. This one isn't as familiar. So what does this mean? What is renunciation?
Well, I agree with you that, I was brought up in as I said, the Church of England, and it just wasn't mentioned. I think we live in a society where renunciation is, outside of some monks maybe in the Roman tradition.
Growing up in the Christian tradition, the scripture is written by people who have nothing. They're oppressed, and then they're gaining, and then they're losing, and then they gain, and they lose. So like this idea isn't as I think fundamental as it is, say in Buddhism, where its founder stepped off of the wealth.
Yeah, he was a prince.
In order to become this teacher.
This quote from scripture here really sort of spoke to me about being in the middle of things, but knowing what you want to focus on is 1 John 4:4. You are of God, little children, and have overcome them, because greater is he that is in you than he that is in the world. And to me, it's just, over the decades of running, my business is called Smile Herb Shop, I just realized that this thing could totally take my priorities in life if I let it. Running a small business and putting my kids through college, and now I have grandchildren. And so I really do, in the midst of worldly activity, try and stay focused on, okay, who am I serving? I'm not serving the money, even though I have to do that as my duty and responsibility. But I really do try and stay focused that I'm serving God. And I'm choosing the Spirit rather than choosing this, because I've been 3 times into the knocking on the door of total burnout, building my company. Yeah. And I just, after the 3rd time, I said, I'm not going to do this anymore. I don't care what happens. This is not a price I'm willing to pay to have money. So I try and stay focused on the spirit of service and cooperation and loving people, etc., and submission, surrender to God, even though what I'm doing is competitive, managerial.
So maybe renunciation is much more about prioritization in our culture than it is just about, it's not the removal of something, but it's the removal of the ownership over us.
Well, and that's what I think, I've learned to say this too, if I understand Mayor Baba correctly, because some of these points are, looks like the layers of an onion. But I think that's why he says, is the real renunciation is that which abandons in the midst of worldly duties, all selfish thoughts and desires. I think if what he meant was, the sort of the St. Francis model where you choose to marry poverty
Yeah.
and Francis, to the end of, I just read a book about Francis that Nikos Kazantzakis wrote, and it's brilliant. But until the end of his life, he, against the advice of those who held the orders, the bishops that held the orders for his group, and against the people in his group, he insisted on, for himself, absolute poverty to the point where he would put a little bit of ash in each meal to remind him, yeah, I know it's really extreme, that he had renounced the world.
Wow.
Yeah, but even in his order, the Franciscan order, they wanted comfortable beds, and he refused to sleep on anything but a plank and like that. He just, he was ecstatic in love for God, and he chose that type of renunciation. But that's not at all, I think, what is meant by Mayor Baba here in the midst of worldly duties. The next one is the only real knowledge is the knowledge that God is the inner dweller in good people and so-called bad, in saint and so-called sinner. This knowledge requires you to help all equally as circumstances demand, without expectation of reward, and when compelled to take part in a dispute, to act without the slightest trace of enmity or hatred, to try to make others happy with brotherly or sisterly feeling for each one, to harm no one in thought, word, or deed, not even those who harm you. To me, this is a long acknowledgement that the knowledge that God is in each person requires certain behaviors.
Yeah.
And I couldn't agree more that the way we dispute with each other is absurd in a spiritual sense. We've got to do better than that. We've got to get, we were talking earlier about having an argument with total respect. You and I were just talking about that, yeah.
Yeah, that's such a rare thing to find, and when you do see it, it's when you see it, it's never the stuff that goes viral. You never see a viral conversation of two people having well thought out arguments and giving long consideration of the other one's point. But I think this starts so much in the way we're trained, because we have this conquering mentality that we want to win. We even talk about winning an argument.
Mm-hmm.
And I mean, typically to win an argument is to lose the person you're arguing with. I remember this couple went in for marriage counseling, and they're meeting with this pastor, and the woman said, "I just wish he would treat me like a Denny's waitress. He's so kind to Denny's waitresses."
Aw.
And it's this heart that's just basically like, why do we feel like the people we're closest to we can say anything to, and then the people who are strangers we won't? We'll either be more polite, or we'll just stuff it, or we'll just stand at a distance, which you can do now with the internet, and just troll on them. We've lost the capacity to dispute. In fact, I heard a Christian educator talking to a Jewish theologian, and he said, "What can us Christians learn from you Jews? What do you think is the best thing that we can learn from you?" She said, "You Christians have no idea how to fight." She said, the Talmud is not just key doctrines, but it preserves key arguments.
Right.
We disagree with each other. She says, even the heretics are our heretics. She's like, we take them all in because we actually think that the dispute is a sacred part of it. And so we think of dispute as something we either have to we got to get through this dispute or get through this conflict. But actually there's what is key actually in a lot of the Jewish culture is that the debate is sacred. My favorite scene in this movie called Yentl is they're all sitting there on the back of this thing and they're just arguing with each other.
Sure.
And it was like, this is a study session. A study session is argument.
Sure.
It's fast paced. It's well thought out. There's no wonder that statistically speaking, the Jewish people have a 15-point IQ advantage on the rest of humanity.
Is that true?
Yeah, it is.
I didn't know that.
Yeah. Because they have at the core, there's this desire to dispute and argue and to do it well.
I love the Jewish saying that if both people always agree, at least one of them isn't thinking. Yeah.
I love the story about the two Jewish rabbis who were arguing about a scripture and what it means. And then after 40 years of hearing them argue about the same scripture, God comes down and says, "Oh, I'll tell you what the scripture means." And they both look at each other and then look back to God and they say, "We're having a conversation here. Don't you butt in.
Don't interrupt.
Don't interrupt what we're talking about here. Like, we're doing the work right here." And I
Sure.
think if there was just not necessarily that, not the flippancy of it or anything like that, but it's trying to make an extreme point, and that
Sure.
point is like that the disagreement is sacred.
Yeah, I agree.
And if we learn to do that well, we'll probably honor our partners in life. So much of this, I think, starts in the home, which is why I started with that story.
And I love the phrase here, so-called sinner. That knowledge of that God is the inner dweller in good people and so-called bad, in saint and so-called sinner. And that choice of language is not an accident, I believe, because Mayor Baba knew language. For somebody who didn't talk for 44 years, he used language really well.
Yeah.
And he really is making the point, it's only so-called bad and so-called sinner. Yeah. Okay, we ready to move on to the next one?
Let's do it.
Okay, control. The only real control is the discipline of the senses from indulgence in low desires, which alone ensures absolute purity of character. I'm just going to quote 1 Corinthians 10. It says, "You have no temptation taken but you as is common to every man. God is faithful, who will not suffer you to be tempted above that which you are able, but with the temptation also give you a way to escape, that ye may be able to bear it."
Immediately what came to mind was Soren Kierkegaard, who said, "Purity of heart is to will one thing." If you will one thing, to choose the highest thing, everything else sort of goes away. And I actually like how this is stated because it says the indulgence of low desires, because there are high desires.
Yeah, that's true. Purpose is not without desire. You got to do a lot of stuff to make a relationship. You just walk into a marriage and say, "Well, let's have a great marriage, perfect communication, absolute purity of character." It doesn't happen by itself. You've got to, have some desire. There's some passion to make a marriage work. Yeah.
Yeah.
All right.
I don't have a ton more on that one, actually.
That's good. We can't improve on what we've already said. That's good.
That was
time
brief,
to go on to the final.
Brief, but good, yeah.
The final frontier. This is the last one in this episode. The only real surrender is that in which the poise is undisturbed by any adverse circumstance, and the individual, amidst every kind of hardship, is resigned with perfect calm to the will of God. That describes your life better than mine.
Oh my gosh.
Yeah.
That resigned with perfect will or calm to the will of God. I don't think there's been a sentence that I relate to less than that so far. Yeah, I wonder. This one's hard for me. I think you're gonna have to help me out here because I think I'm a little lost on this, and maybe I don't know if there's like I don't know what it is. So I'm a little lost. Help me out here.
Well, I struggle with perfect poise in the midst of every kind of hardship. So let's just clarify just how not unattainable, how challenging the standard that Christ has set here is Matthew 7:21. He says, "Not everyone who says unto me, Lord, Lord, shall enter the kingdom of heaven, but he that does the will of my Father, which is in heaven, will inherit the kingdom." But just the whole idea that you could know the will of Abba is such an assumption. I mean, of course, Christ is saying this, who knows the will of his Father, but it's a very high standard. And
how specific are we being here? Because if we're saying that, well, the will of God is to love God and love others, then we're becoming surrendered to that. I've got you on board, but it's just if we get more specific than that, I think you lose me as far as that. I can't get my head around it.
Well, it's an incredible standard. Let's just go over it again. The poise that is undisturbed by any adverse circumstance. That's pretty poised. And the individual, amidst every kind of hardship, is resigned with perfect calm to the will of God. That is a very high standard. So let's just look at it as a work in progress. And I would say I see it from time to time that if we have surrendered our attachment to results and our will to God, that we don't lose our poise and our mindfulness. Mindfulness is the big word these
This
days.
is a big word, yeah.
It is the big word these days. So, that, and again, I think that's the value of Scripture. Like there's a quote here from the Quran quoting Abraham, putting words in Abraham's mouth, and he says, "Hence we shall certainly bear with patience whatever hurt you may do to us. For all who have trust in His existence must place their trust in God alone." And I think I obviously get this from Christ's submission to God's will to be sacrificed on the cross. He did say, "Take this cup away from me," but when he didn't have the cup taken away from him, he had to go do that. And there's this real sense of poise on the cross. I mean, he did ask God why he was forsaken, but other than that, it's a heck of a thing to be asked to do that level of surrender. But I think that's the example that, whatever we in our conscience and our real intuition in our heart of hearts believe is God's will for us, I think we have to sort of say, if it really is God's will for us, that there's a poise to it, a mindfulness, that that's what we're supposed to be doing. And, don't take this wrong, Jim. Whatever you think of what I'm supposed to be doing is only your opinion.
Of course, yeah.
Of course, yeah. But I think that's where the poise comes from, that we have confidence in our own inner voice. One of the great Quaker analogies is if there's two rooms, one is completely dark and one is filled with light, and there's a door in between, and you open the door, does the darkness penetrate the light? No, the darkness disappears. But, all of that, like you were talking about a conviction, I mean, it's just a work in progress to decide which spirit we're going to believe in. And if we believe in the spirit of the world, then we're going to go up and down and not have poise, because that's the nature of results. But if we really do have conviction and really surrender to the will of that which is before creation, it was before creation, God was still there, and will be after creation, then there really is a poise with that, a mindfulness. And again, with all of this, it's so easy to say it or read it, but to really apply it in our relationships and our businesses and stuff, it's a work in progress. But that's why I really like this exercise of Scripture. Okay, so if it's important enough for Jesus to mention it, Mayor Baba meant to mention it, and the Quran to mention it, even though it's a work in progress, it's a goal to hold. It's a purpose to have poise in the midst of activity, because we get so rewarded, as you said earlier, Jim, by being right and winning the argument. And this is the opposite of that.
Yeah. As you're saying that makes more sense to me. And I think I have a trouble with the concept of surrender, just because I have a hard time with surrender in my life, period.
Mm-hmm.
But I was trying to understand it, and the only way that I could do it is that made sense. And some of the things you said triggered me to think, oh, well, what's the opposite of surrender? It's resistance. It's resistance to the will of God.
Mm-hmm.
And so often, I even as a kid, I used to go out in the ocean, and like the wave is coming at me, and I want to stand and just like take it,
Sure.
and like resist it, boom, in the wave. And I mean, water weighs what, like, it's like, I can't remember it, but it weighs a lot.
It'll knock you down. It'll knock you down. Yes.
It knocks you down. And then now with surfing, like I actually put on the bottom of my surfboard, breathe, you are not in control, enjoy the ride.
That's a pretty good definition of surrender.
And I think that is surrender. It's like, because I'm committed. If I'm distracted, if I'm thinking about a bunch of different things, I'm going to miss the ride. I'm going to miss the wave. And if I'm in the wrong spot, I'm just going to get bowled over. And I think so many times we experience pain in our life because we are resistant to that which is unstoppable. We are not an unstoppable force, and we are not an immovable object. We are. And we have to actually move with the flow of these things that are coming around us, and to resist them is pointless. And I think I probably
Resistance is-
carry so many scars in my life precisely because I tried to resist instead of surrender to, like, this is the wave. The wave is coming. It is moving towards the shore. It is unstoppable by any force in nature. They have these like 100-foot waves that roll in Portugal. Like, it was like the highest ever recorded, but regularly they'll get like 60-footers. And the thing is, the force of it moving is 30,000 tons. Like, you're talking about and to resist the will of God is as futile as resisting that. The part I probably just have a hard times with is like resigned with perfect calm. I've never seen that. And even as I look at Jesus, like when he's looking at the will of God, he's praying that the cup would be taken from him as he sits in this garden called Gethsemane, which means pressing, because it was an oil press where they would bring the oil or the olives from the top of the hill, and they'd bring them down the hill and put them on the press where they would press them 3 times. And he sits there and he's pressed 3 times saying, God, take this cup from me, but not my will, yours be done. But it's not a perfect calm. It's I am willing, but I understand, like, this is hard. There's a lot of things, you can take with perfect calm, but there's a lot of things in your life that they deserve resistance. It's like you told the story earlier about the Westerners and the kid being thrown in the water.
Oh yeah.
And the person of the other faith just resigned. It's just God's will.
Yeah, sure.
I just accept it.
Yeah.
And the other ones are like, no,
we're going to risk our
gonna
lives
risk
to
our
save this
lives
kid.
to
Yeah,
save
they
this
did,
kid.
and they did save the kid.
And I think that there's so who was more surrendered in that moment to the will of God? The one with perfect calm, maybe if he's perfectly calm, like you don't know the motivation. Maybe he's really resigned to the will of God. Maybe that's really what he believes. Maybe he just won't risk his life for a kid. But the other ones, I would say, are the more surrendered ones, even though they are the least perfect calm because they're jumping into freezing water to save someone.
No, they were risking their lives.
Risking their lives,
somebody.
yeah.
It was,
Which is not a position of calm and poise. But it is surrender. It is movement with, in the oneness with love.
well spoken. I don't think anything can be improved on there. And
Oh, sure there could. We just need someone else to do it.
fair enough. So that brings us to the end of our 3rd episode of Mystical Connections, Let Your Life Speak. So I'd just like to really thank Jim. This has been just an excellent conversation. Made me really learn some things about myself and, think some new thoughts. And so thank you so much, Jim, for joining this conversation. And
Yes. And if anyone wants to find more about me, they can go to jimzartman.com or check out one of the works that I'm doing right now is the Enneagram Panels Project. You can check that out on iTunes or wherever you get your podcasts. And hopefully we'll get to meet some of you in person at some point today, and we'll get to expand this conversation with a lot more people, because that would be the ultimate dream, I think, for me in this.
well, as they say in the mountains, God willing and the creek don't rise. Thank you so much for joining us. I wanted to give you a way to follow up, which is our website, befriendlyministries.org, and to give you the titles that are available to you if you choose to help us in this work. The first book available is Where Other Faiths Agree with Jesus. The second one is the actual compilation itself, the 33 Habits of Highly Effective Prophets. Then we have one about William Penn called Architect of Unity Between Christianity and Islam. That's what William Penn did. We have another book called Where Other Faiths Agree with Mayor Baba. There's another book, Where Other Faiths Agree with Gandhi, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., and the Quakers. Then there's a workbook for your church or school to help you teach the 33 habits, which is called the Workbook of the 33 Habits of Highly Effective Prophets. And finally, we have a workbook and book that shows where all the 11 religions teach forgiveness, and quotes from 11 different faiths on forgiveness. So again, that's befriendlyministries.org, and thank you so much for joining us.